Marcy McInelly, and I just want to let you know there are, if you're searching for AIA credit sign-up sheets, they're in the back at the table. Welcome to the Art of Complete and Connected Streets session that is mostly devoted to John Massengale and Victor Dover talking about their new book, which is due out October 21st. Let me just introduce them and then introduce the topic a little bit and then let them go on from there with John leading and Victor following. And then I hope we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. As you know, I'm Marcy McInelly and co-chair with Norman Garrick for several years of the Project for Transportation Reform. And we've done a number of things I'm going to talk about briefly here. But first, let me tell you who John and Victor are. Really, most of you know them. But John Massengale has won awards for architecture, urbanism, historic preservation, and architectural history. An architect and urbanist in New York City, he is the chair of the CNU New York chapter and co-author with Robert A.M. Stern and Gregory Gilmartin of New York 1900. This is one of my favorite books. The first architecture book nominated for a National Book Award. Urban designer and town planner Victor Dover, AICP, is a charter member of the Congress for the New Urbanism, meaning he was there in the very beginning. As principal in charge of Dover, Kohl and Partners, a leading new urbanist town planning firm in Coral Gables, Florida, Dover has won multiple CNU charter awards. Now John and Victor have collaborated on a new book due out this year from Wiley Publishers called Street Design, The Art and Practice of Making Complete Streets. Knowing them both, I imagine the book writing would be a very interesting story by itself. But that's not what they're going to talk about today. They're going to talk more about the content of the book. But let me just go on and let you know a little bit about the Project for Transportation Reform, which has published to date its own couple of books. Let me see if I can get this to work. Many of you might know about the CNU ITE manual, the first ever collaboration between engineers in the ITE, Institute of Transportation Engineers, and CNU. It's a pretty thick volume with lots of tables, some pictures, not a lot. It's kind of hard reading, but it's very useful to those of us who are trying to change the way that especially state DOTs use AASHTO standards. And then some of you might know about the little blue book. See, we call these books, kind of it's an inside joke a little bit on AASHTO, we call the green book our green book, and we call the blue book our little blue book, because there's so much the opposite of what AASHTO's green and blue books are about. The Sustainable Street Network Principles is the blue book on the upper right. It's widely available. You can download it from CNU. You can view it on Issue, the little web link that allows you to view a book in full spread. And you can get a copy free, so really just talk to me or anybody at CNU. It's in its second publication, and I would call it the way I try to describe that is it's the simple version of the Green Book. And then the Project for Transportation Reform has its own website and is always full of interesting information, and some of you may have even been participating in this initiative over the last several years and attended some of the summits that we've had. So all that said, I want to go on now to introduce this topic. Some of you are aware that in some of our cities, streets occupy a large percentage of land. It's usually between 30 to 40% of land area. And we call this, those of us in the New Urbanist movement, we call this the public realm. But it is so far from looking like anything that is public or is civic in the way that the word realm connotes. And that's what we want to talk about a little bit more today. This land, the 40%, some places 30%, is land that we all own collectively. And I've always thought that we ought to have a lot more say about its design. And when we talk about the design of the public realm, we know, first of all, it's not very good. It doesn't represent a very high level of quality, and it's far from beautiful or art. It's mostly a byproduct of a number of specialist codes, and requirements. The codes and requirements that lead to its design are the usual suspects. They come from the usual suspects: emergency responders, traffic engineers, police. But there are also some things that lead to its design that we don't talk about very much. I think that Victor and John are going to talk about it more. You might not think that transit engineers dictate a lot about design of streets, but they do. So do advocates for bikes and traffic calming. So some of the things that are being put in our streets to protect us bicyclists and to make us pedestrians safer are actually making our streets ugly, and we're concerned about that. So I just want to walk you through some of the philosophical paradigm shift that the Project for Transportation Reform stands for. It's a series of steps, and many of you, I know, are probably already at the very advanced stage of this, but bear with me. Streets as public space, streets and buildings that work together to create rooms, street network legibility, bringing nature in, creating choices, abundance, and freedom through transit and other modes, and the idea that walking is the fundamental unit that defines the public realm. So we summarized these principles in the little blue book, 7 principles and 6 key characteristics. And I think that if we start to think about streets as public space, it's not too far a stretch to start thinking about streets as public realm and streets as places. And we know that streets have so many more roles to fulfill than just moving cars. They've always been the center of commerce, promoting the exchange of goods, ideas, and wealth. So one of the principles in the book is specifically about that: streets that support communities and places, and streets that attract and sustain economic activity. And then it's not too far a stretch to begin to reimagine streets as public space. So some of the most important space in cities with a civic role to fulfill, and to really begin to think of these as public realm with a kind of a capital P and a capital R, with all of the beauty, art, and grandeur that that term connotes. And I think in many ways the paradigm shift that we're engaged in CNU about streets is not so much about reimagining, it's about remembering what streets used to be. So in this picture, just one of the spreads in the blue book, we show children at play and pedestrians at large. And I use those terms deliberately because I read a really interesting book last year called Fighting Traffic by Peter Norton. And it helped me remember that streets used to be full of children at play and pedestrians at large. And in this amazing book, Peter Norton writes specifically about the period from about 1920 to 1930, when the newly forming organizations like AAA that were promoting the takeover of streets waged an extremely skillful campaign to shame those pedestrians at large and children at play from the streets. They helped create a class of crimes, including jaywalking, which had never existed before. So streets were made safe for cars, and anyone not in a car in the street as a pedestrian or a child was a jaywalker and committing a felony. And Peter Norton describes this. This book is pretty long. It talks a lot about the social reconstruction that we went through as a country about our streets during that one decade. So for one thing, one of the things we're trying to do through the Project for Transportation Reform is get back to a more democratic allocation of the street space. One, for instance, where the sidewalk isn't just a blue strip that separates the parking lot from the auto-dominated street, but it's something that, as in the middle panel shows, something that has as much art and science about its various sub-realms that are as complicated and worthy of design as all of the areas within the street that we spend a lot of the last 50 years engineering. And to a more democratic allocation of the street space, I can say, as a resident of Portland, Oregon, I can attest to the fact that if you build it more democratically, that is, people will come and use it. I often hear people say things like, why should we build sidewalks there? No one walks. Or, why should we make a place for bikes? No one but tweakers and drug dealers ride bikes here. And well, in Portland, we built it, and People use it no matter how rainy, how stormy, how wintry. And the tweakers and the drug dealers are vastly outnumbered by the families with kids in trailers, mature CEO commuter types, and young creative class entrepreneurs. And I put this picture in here because it's a friend of mine in Portland who works at the bike program, who took a picture one rainy day. I think these were 18-mile-per-hour winds, but they weren't stopping the 20-mile-per-hour winds, but it wasn't stopping the 18 or 20 bicycle commuters coming in on the bridge in one platoon. So in Portland, I know it works. Build it and they walk, build it and they bike. Another idea that we're promoting very successfully with the help of all of our colleagues also working on form-based codes is streets and buildings work together to define the public realm. They really contribute equally, but because of the way that we've separated those two disciplines, they hardly ever get worked on together. So form-based codes are helping bring back the design of the streets and the buildings into a more collaborative exercise. And it's interesting in early photos that we see, I think John and Victor will show some, even though like in the early 1900s, we see pictures of streets where the street surface is dirt, but great care has still been taken to frame that plot of dirt with significant buildings because there was such a strong sense that these places were rooms and were important. Through form-based codes, I think we're beginning to get back to that strong, natural relationship between those two things. A little bit more esoteric idea, but one that is also part of our movement. We think back on beautiful city designers who used to connect. They would use the street networks to connect important destinations with distinctive and memorable streets that served as places. We know, for instance, where City Beautiful designers did really complete work in Kansas City, Longview, Washington, a city where I recently did a transportation system plan, and even in Chicago that legibility was built into the street system. But unfortunately, that legibility has been erased by functional classification, which is all about dictating the shape and character of the street based on how many cars it has to move through an area, not between what natural features it might be linking or what mountain it might be framing. So we had a principle in the book to get us back to that, which is the scale and orientation of streets celebrate unique local and regional characteristics, including those of the natural and built environment. And I'm getting to the end. This is actually my last slide. So get ready, John. We are trying to get back to the idea that walking is the fundamental unit for street design. And the reason why human scale design and beauty in streets is so important as we reclaim the most important function of our streets, which is primarily walking and other things. All right. Do you want to stand up?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, I'll start sitting down. Can we get this a little? You're in the middle.
I think I'm stealing your...
We're not even showing that today. You can just start with first slide.
This is the first slide.
Well, go ahead. Okay.
Do you want to see?
I'm okay. Thank you, Marcy. So I'm going to start sitting down because while Marcy's been talking, I've had a little technology failure, and so I'm going to sit down to look at what I have here. So as you heard, Victor and I have written a street design book that will come out October 21st from J. Wiley & Sons, who publish a lot of the best new urban books. It's pretty exciting for us. It has 500 photos, commentary and analysis by Victor and me, and contributions by many new urbanists, including Andres Dwani, Douglas Dwani, John Norquist, Stefanos Palazoides, Jim Kunstler from Europe, Leon Creer, Hank Dittmar, Paul Moraine, Gabriel Tagliaventi, and even the Prince of Wales. And I know I've forgotten some, so we've made a complete list that Victor is going to show at the end. We've started giving talks about the book, and today we're giving a condensed version, so there's time for Q&A. And because, you know, this audience doesn't need Street Design 101. So let's jump in. So this is Broadway in New York City in 1908, and a photo taken from the elevated subway line at Herald Square, looking towards Times Square. The low building on the right is McKinney and White's New York Herald building, and in the distance you can see the New York Times Tower designed by Leopold Eidlitz. What we want to look at today, and do we have a pointer?
Yes.
Thank you. What we want to look at today is the street, which has no traffic signs, no stop signs, no stoplights, no striping, and it has streetcars in the middle of the street and people standing in the middle of the street waiting to get on the streetcars, and of course cars, carriages, etc. You can see most of the people are over on the sidewalk, but you can also see they feel comfortable stepping out onto the street. This is New York today, on a complete street being copied across the country, promoted by the National Association of City Transportation Officials, NACTO. 50 years of organized motordom has transformed the New York City street from what we see in the first photo to what you see here, and we're going to come back to this. Now, one thing we talk about in the book is one of the easiest ways to improve a street is to put in a great alley of trees with a great canopy. We talk about why engineers don't like the fixed hazardous objects in the vegetative containment zone, and why even many landscape architects and arborists can oppose planting a traditional streetscape like this, as many of you know, because you've run into this. And we go into how to go against standard practice to get a great canopy like this. So let's talk about something other than the vegetative containment zones for a minute and look at one of the great streets of America. If you haven't been to Nantucket Island, it is, every urbanist should go to Nantucket. It was once the whaling center of the world, a very rich place, and then the Industrial Revolution came, and suddenly it was a very poor place and a long way from jobs on the mainland. And so the islanders made a decision a very long time ago that they were going to become one of the great resorts of the world. They set out to do that. They succeeded so well that by the First World War, when the town actually wanted to cut down some of the trees, it was the off islanders who prevented that from happening because they loved the island so much. And what's happened since that time is that it's pretty much a place for vacation people. You know, you might compare it to Seaside, which we always hear, well, that's not a town, that's a resort. And Nantucket is also a resort with some absolutely fantastic streets. And it's been through a history of that we also go through in the book of the S&H Green Stamp heir at one point started up buying a lot of the downtown, and has a lot to do with the way it looks today. And more recently, Google, one of the main Google heirs, has set up an organization called Remain Nantucket, R-E-M-A-I-N Nantucket, where they focus on Main Street. Sorry, I've got too many buttons here. So the preceding picture was Main Street at dusk. It's an interesting place. It's 85 feet across, which is exactly the dimension that Bob Gibbs tells us is ideal for a shopping street, because it's both big enough to be a place and yet narrow enough that you can see from one side of the street to the other. It has primarily 19th century architecture, pretty spiffed up these days, but still mainly 19th century architecture. Because the attitude in Nantucket is we love what we have, and we have to have a good reason for changing it. So that, for example, in the just a little bit below this picture, there's an old horse trough in the middle of the street. And you'll see at the other end of the street, there's a big granite obelisk in the middle of the street. And Nantucket doesn't worry about these things. You know, they say that this has been like this for 100 years. It works for us. We like it. We're not going to let people talk us out of it. And one of the reasons it works is because of these cobblestone streets that, you know, you drive slowly on cobblestone streets, and we'll talk about the effect that that has on accidents, speed limits, things like that. So it's got a wonderful physical environment. An awful lot of people on the island come to the center of town every day just for the experience of being there. And you see them standing around in the streets, not necessarily shopping, just enjoying Main Street. As you move up Main Street to the top of Main Street, this is the building. This is a bank that terminates Main Street. It's 85 feet wide here, and then Main Street goes off to the left here. This, I think, is Court Street. Anyway, it's a beautiful street. There are a number of beautiful streets in Nantucket. And as you continue up Main Street, you come to the great houses from the whaling time. These actually were 3 houses built by Captain Starbucks for his family. The coffee chain is named after Captain Starbucks. However, the coffee chain is not allowed in Nantucket because starting with Beinecke and continuing, Beinecke was the S&H heir, and continuing with Remain Nantucket, they worked very hard to have local stores. And so they have regulations on things like, the number of stores. I'm making this up, but it's something like this. If the store has more than 3 branches where they wear uniforms, they're not allowed in Nantucket, that sort of thing. And Remain Nantucket has put a lot of investment capital into buying buildings, to renting out to local businesses, to giving grants to local businesses, things like that, including 2 bookstores, the ubiquitous cupcake store, etc. So the street itself is a fantastic street. You saw that a lot of the old elms on Lower Main were lost in the Dutch elm blight, but a lot of the elms on Upper Main still exist, and it's still it's cobblestone all the way, brick sidewalks, granite curbs, good dimension across, good simple architecture, and so popular that Nantucket was one of the first places to do a preservation code that's sort of a weak version of a form-based code, but talks about things like vertical window openings and roof pitches and things like that. Here's another view in Upper Main. You can see how one of the things we talk about in the book is one way to lay out a beautiful street on traditional topography is often to lay it out as though you have no earth-moving equipment, so that you don't just drop it on the hill like a blanket, but you work with the amount of earth you have to move and that sort of thing in order to move, in order to make the street. And And, you know, when you do a corner, it's not the constant radii, but it varies with the topography. Just continuing up along Main Street. And then when you get to the intersection of Milk and Main, you have this, this war memorial in the middle of the street. And at least one person in this room has had the experience of putting a granite obelisk in the middle of the street, having it lit, having striping, having warning signs. And at some point, something happened, like the lights went out and a drunk hit it, and, you know, of course, the urban designer was among the people sued. But one thing we're going to look at is that what happens when you lower speed limits, which the cobblestones do by default. And so, oh no, this isn't Main Street, sorry. This is a complete street after a road diet in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. You can see it's nice and slim now. And, you know, if I showed this slide and said this photo was taken in 1952, the only reason you would know it wasn't taken in 1952 is because of the green bike lanes. And so this is back to the complete street in First Avenue. And as Marcy said, New York is where I live. You know, 80% of New Yorkers do not own cars. Only 20% of people who commute from outside the city commute by car. And yet here, you know, in the same place where we have the greatest DOT in the city, in the world practically, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit, we have this suburban arterial built for suburbanites to drive in and out of New York at the expense of New Yorkers. You know, I could have showed Second Avenue in my neighborhood. Second Avenue in my neighborhood will get this same treatment. It's also the primary shopping street and outdoor dining street of my neighborhood. And it should not be a suburban arterial. And it should not have, on Second Avenue, they're actually going to remove the parking, so the express lane will be right next to the sidewalk. And they've set up these buses that go extra fast now with blinking lights on them. And then over on the other side, you have what's sometimes called the Copenhagen lane, although it's not anything they would recognize in Copenhagen. And you know, I say this is a suburban arterial because it's a one-way road designed for throughput. The speed limit is 30 miles per hour, but the traffic lights are more like 40, 45 miles per hour, so that if you go the right speed with the staggered lights, I've gone over 80 blocks without stopping. And in order to do that, you have to go over 40 miles per hour. And so obviously the car is still king. You know, vehicle throughput is what this road is about. And then over on one side you've got the red bike lane, the red bus lane, and over here you've got the green bus lane. So, you know, space has been allocated for bicycle throughput, for bus throughput, but this is all engineering. This is all throughput. There's nothing here about placemaking. There's nothing here about the public realm for the people who live here, who do not own cars, and who use this as their dining space. So I did just want to say, because in many ways we do have a great DOT, I didn't want to pick on them without showing some of the good things they're doing. You know, they've built 350 miles of bike lanes. We just started the bike share program Monday. The DOT commissioner is Jeanette Sadiq Khan, whom we call a hero in the book, because Jeanette was one of the first DOT commissioners in America to say, you know, I'm the DOT commissioner, I control the streets, I can do what I want, and I'm not going to do it for the car. And so she sent these crews out to places like Madison Square. They arrived about 11 o'clock at night. They had paint, they had white plastic sticks, they had this furniture, and they started grabbing parts of the road for people. And when the cars came at 6 a.m. the next morning, half the street was gone. And these are, as you can imagine, these are enormously popular. And they're really fantastic examples of tactical urbanism. We also talk in the book about ways that design could be better, but you know that's one of the points of tactical urbanism is you try things out. So here's 9th Avenue, a little bit of a detail of what they're doing, and you know the problem is when you step out on here with the white plastic sticks, with the striping, with the you can't see the big arrows down there for the left turn lanes. You know you're not in a people space, you're in an auto space. And that makes sense in front of Kmart out in the burbs, but it does not make sense in New York City. Now this is in Long Beach. We had the CNU Transportation Summit in Long Beach. Long Beach is a fantastic place. It's a real city. It's trying very hard to bring back, or not to bring back because it has it, to improve its urbanism. It's sometimes called the Brooklyn of Los Angeles. And you can see that they've used a complete street, which is very similar to the NACTO one, which when a person is standing here, crossing the street, you know, clearly there's no placemaking here. This is a complete street, which like many complete streets, the first purpose of the street is to get cars flowing. Here's another view of the same street. The bike lane next to the sidewalk. You know, this is not a very pleasant sidewalk. It's not placemaking. This engineering-wise, this makes a lot of sense to put the parking out here. But an enormous number of New Yorkers complain about these asymmetrical streets with the parking sort of floating out in the middle of the street. So my time is almost up. Obviously, what we're talking about is not going back to this time. And yet, neither do we want to ignore, you know, what our streets used to be. There were places. This is not a shared space. You know, most of the people are over here, but it is a place where cars go slowly enough so that people feel comfortable walking out onto the street. It's not dominated by all the detritus of traffic engineers, and it's a place where, by default, these cars are going slowly enough so that if they hit you, there's a good chance they're not going to kill you, at least. One thing that a lot of places are doing now, this also comes from NACTO, who did that First Avenue design. They show how, as you slow down, it's not only that you have more time, the driver has more time to react, you know, so that as the driver is approaching the granite obelisk, he has time to brake, but he actually sees much more. This is 15, does that say? And this is, you know, this is only 30. But you see how little the driver is seeing at 13 compared to 15. And a big point is around 20, particularly in terms of pedestrian fatalities. And so then when you get the cars going that slowly again, you know, you have time to slow down, and you have time to see the driver has time to see the whole situation, and you can get rid of all the striping, all the yellow lines, all the lawsuits against the poor urban designer. So closing, I talked about 2nd Avenue. This is something Victor and I did. There's the before. This street is currently all dug up for the 2nd Avenue subway, and when they put it back again, they're going to build something like the First Avenue that I showed. And we're saying, you know, let's introduce some variety into the grid. This is the great outdoor shopping space and dining space of the neighborhood. Let's try to improve that. Obviously, this is something based on some of the Ramblas in Barcelona, which we cover quite a bit. And then the last thing I'll say before handing off to Victor, some of you have seen the petition we have for the USDOT. We went to the USDOT last week. When I say we, I mean Victor, Rick Hall, myself. People have been going to transportation summits, have heard a long time about the idea that we proposed to the DOT, which was quite well received, which is that the FHWA functional classifications system of rural urbanized, in other words, a two-part transect, be changed into rural, suburban, urban, only a three-part transect. And the urban would probably be only 10 to 20% of the area that's now called urbanized. So for the moment, you know, we're not challenging the traffic engineer in most of the places where he works, but we are saying in our walkable towns and places, we need a set of regulations in which the norm is two-way streets, slow speeds, no turning lanes, etc. And I know Victor is going to talk a little bit more about that at the end. And I believe we have the petitions for you to sign. So thank you.
Okay, Marcy, I need you. Thanks very much. Well, thanks, everybody. Good afternoon. You know, there's no better way to celebrate a midlife crisis than trying to write a book on something you thought you knew a lot about. And jumping on airplanes with John Massengale and flying around with a camera and thinking you know what you're taking pictures of, only to try and look at them again when you have about 15,000 of them and decide what they mean. And I did turn 50 this year. There are two anniversaries involved. The 50th anniversary of my birth means that I felt like we better kick it in gear because I only have 75 years left to get all this crap done that we're trying to do. And it's also this week at CNU is the third anniversary of the day John and I started writing the book. So it took us about a year.
Talking about writing the book.
It took us about a year, and then it took us 2 more years to decide on a subtitle. But that's another long story. But looking around CNU, I feel like we, as a 21-year-old organization, we also have our own midlife crisis. And things like picking a subject, something you thought you knew really well, and trying to do a deeper dive on it and question some of your old assumptions and challenge some of the dogma and orthodoxy you grew up with and you've been expounding on, is a very healthy thing to do. You know, the danger, of course, is if we don't do something like that, instead of being at CNU22, we're going to be at AARP22. Sorry, just couldn't resist. So that is, in fact, the key to keeping our organization fresh and our movement fresh, is to go look at things more critically. And so we went back as part of doing the work and researching the book, we went back to places that we had visited before, that we thought we knew well, and this time we measured them a little more carefully, and we watched them a little more carefully. We saw it had been changed in them since we were kids and since we were there in the meantime, and watching how places had evolved. And a few things slid into focus for us. One is that even the best cities are completely overrun in traffic. You know, new urbanists go take pictures of Paris, and then don't show them to their clients because they're Europe. We've got to get over that, by the way. We need to, 21 years later, we can show pictures of Europe. I'm just announcing that the moratorium is hereby lifted, okay? We have 500 pictures in the book. We also have pictures from Asia. You know, there's lots of things in there you can show. Let's assume that the conversation has grown up just a little bit. But we found that many of the places that were pleasant are, in fact, being damaged by just too much driving. This Second Avenue misplaced priorities in Manhattan were kind of an indicator of that, when so many people use the street as their own neighborhood street, and yet all of its qualities are being sacrificed for the benefit of long-distance commuters who are sort of invading the space with their cars and taking up the majority of it, wrecking the majority of its character, even though they are, in fact, a minority of the population of users. And so we went back to those places and asked questions. And then we tried to categorize anew the old catalog, the essential street types that new urbanists all study and think about. And we found that it was too small, not surprisingly. The menu, even our expanded menu, which was bigger than arterial, collector, and local, was still too small. And in fact, this is a fraction of it. These are the 11 essential ones that we cover in some detail in the book, with help from a lot of others who wrote about these things. And then we looked for examples, historic examples, retrofit examples, and newly built examples. We could find some new ones in most of the categories, but certainly not all of them. And we asked questions about the retrofits that had taken place, because as John explained, billions of dollars are being spent in a really fantastic, exciting campaign of good intentions. The Complete Streets campaign, which has the best bumper sticker in the history of city planning, but of course needs a design vocabulary to live up to the quality of that bumper sticker. And we asked ourselves what had happened in the best retrofits. And guess what? Some of the best ones we found were really, really simple and relate to this issue of networks. For example, Kensington High Street in London is a really important street for getting into this part of town. It's really the celebration, the ceremonial gateway of that place, but it had been harmed over the years by being transformed into what Kunstler calls an auto sewer, when it's sized according to the amount of sewage you need to put through the pipe, and then the traffic is the equivalent of the liquid sewage. Well, they changed Kensington High Street in our generation, and just a few years ago, they radically redid it. And they remade the size of things, as we would do in a good road diet or a good complete streets project. They gave more space to pedestrians. They restored the on-street parking. They, in a great, ironic and unexpected move that is very powerful and, as you can see, very popular, they put the bike parking in the center of the median, and there's a lot of it. They also used a really simple vocabulary. There's minimal signs, minimal stripes, minimal texture changes, minimal color in this thing. There's no green streets, there's no red lanes, there's no big wide thermoplastic banding on it. It's simple gray on gray for the most part. And so we document some of those in the book and question them. It's because we feel like those details go with the bigger campaign, which is to learn how to grow our way out of our problems by building on the private land that faces these renewed streets, development that's worthy of them and makes them into better places. The exhibit we all need in America to show that growth and change can make things better rather than worse. Andrew Georgiadis vividly illustrated that idea a few years ago. So I'm going to show 4 things that got rethought as we were going through it. Maybe just catching up with some of you. I look around the room and I see a lot of people who actually worked on the projects that we cover in the book, and mostly praising them, by the way, but hopefully we're even-handed about it. On the subject of network, the new urbanists are in the habit of drawing all of the pieces of the pedestrian and vehicular and cycling connectedness. And we've learned that it's better to be like a web than be like a tree, and so on. And we draw all those things. A few years ago, Vince Graham did a freehand sketch that turned into a little presentation here on why networks are so powerful for distributing the demand, distributing the traffic, and so on. If you haven't seen this before, you might appreciate it. How do you get from A to B? If you have one road that goes there, we all use it, right? So if all of us need to go from the origin to the destination, we're all going to follow that path. If someone just introduces one more street in each direction, to get us there, now we have a second way to go. You with me so far? Not too complicated, right? All right, it just means we don't all have to use the same intersections at the same time. But once you get to the point where a little bit of redundancy is built into the system, the web becomes more complex or intricate, the block's a little smaller, the intersection's a little more frequent, something pretty powerful happens. If you get just one more street in each direction, you get this way to go, and that way to go, and that way to go. Actually, you get 6 in all, just from introducing one more street in each direction. And it doesn't include any that involve doubling back, to go back by the front yard where you saw your neighbor's granddaughter sunbathing on the way. So no doubling back, Chip Kaufman. This is only the forward-going ones. And then there is actually a math equation for the engineers. You're writing this down, Mr. Hall? Factorials, remember how to do that? Casey Hawthorne, who scored 800 on the math section of the SAT, wrote this up. You don't have to understand how it works, but watch what happens. If you get just 4 by 3, you get 35 ways to get there. If 5 by 4 yields 126 ways from A to B. 8 by 8 gives you 12,870 ways to go from A to B. And that way, that's the plan of Beaufort, South Carolina. One of those little towns we go and study and take photographs of and try to convince clients to build places that good. So that got us thinking about how you quantify the networkedness, right? And when it came time to work out a standard for the LEED-ND, LEED for Neighborhood Development's certification system, the rating system has several things that use this intersection connectedness as a measurement for success. It's effective thoroughfare connectivity, or connectivity for sure. And actually, if you read the formula that's in LEED-ND, it's designed to make it easier for good new urbanist projects to score particularly well, the ones that will have positive public realms, because they do have things like alleys, for example, or the ones that are multimodal in their nature. And so there's a whole series of diagrams that are excerpted in the book that were part of a research project to actually get to the number for LEED-ND. For example, the Woodlands in Texas is 35 intersections per square mile. Miami Lakes and Celebration have more. Celebration has 377 intersections per mile. Miami Lakes, 1950s Newtown, 141. Compare that to Rome. You see what happens? More than 1,000. When there are a lot of streets and a lot of intersections, the whole game changes. And this is where one of the first assumptions had to be burnt, because when we went to Barcelona, for example, to go re-photograph and re-document the great multi-way boulevards, like the Avenida Diagonal or the Gran Via, we stepped out of our hotel into the Body Gothic, the Gothic neighborhood, where the streets are tiny and the intersections are frequent and the blocks are small, like in this part of Rome. And so that led me to want to deliver this to the advanced audience at CNU. Our orthodoxy in CNU, because we fight so hard against the damage that the massive implementation, over-implementation of one-way streets did to downtowns, for example, our orthodoxy just says, no one-way streets, forget it, that's bad, evil, draw a circle with a red line through it, that's what you do on one-way streets. But in fact, that's not the right rule. The right rule is have a whole lot of streets, and then you can make some of them have a less traffic status. You can demote some to one-way, and it won't kill anything. Just for example, here's a picture on the left from the Body Gothic. Now, that street, that experience on that street is a really cool part of that rich menu of skinny streets, right? It's only feasible because there are a lot of streets. If you did that same technique in, say, downtown Richmond, Virginia, which has all big, infrequent, one-way streets, Bill Carroll Westfall has named it the city of no left turns. Well, then the one-way streets are disastrous. But in the Gothic neighborhood in Barcelona, they're not hurting a thing because there are plenty of streets. So take a look at the one in Amsterdam on the right, where that cyclist is really comfortable and the speeds are really slow. And it's really a frequently walked in, easily biked in, managed speed kind of driving in space because there are a lot of streets. So forget this dogma that says no one-way streets. What we should say is a whole lot of streets, and we can afford to make some of them extra special. Take a look at this one, which I know Sandy's photographed in Philadelphia. I think that one's Paul Moraine's photo. Skinny is sexy. And property values go up when the streets are skinny. So this idea that wider is better just because it allows you to make two-way is a bogus argument. In some places, like Jed and Katie Selby's South Main development in Colorado, we're attempting to reintroduce that sort of thing. The slowest street in Colorado is called Swift Street. It's named after the engineer, Peter Swift, who stood up for it and said, hey, we can make a really skinny street here. And it was actually originally conceived as a Wohnhof or a shared space, and instead redesigned in the end as a really small laneway and sidewalks on both sides with a rough texture in it. And so the smallest new street. It's built and it's safe and people are really enjoying having it. An absolute luxury. How could we do that? Well, because the plan has lots of streets. It's a really richly connected network. So demoting one in this way to a little one-way section didn't hurt anything. Another one of our pieces of new urbanist dogma is that pedestrianizing a street space is a bad idea. Again, like the fighting of the bad idea of the over-implementation of the one-way streets in downtowns, we have the over-implementation of the ped mall. That idea that works one time out of 1,000, but when it works, like on Pearl Street in Boulder, it works really, really well and gets everybody confused. Or when it works eventually, like Lincoln Road on Miami Beach did, after 40 years of sitting practically dead, it works really, really well. So you have to ask yourself, well, what is it about those circumstances that makes them work? One of the things that makes them work is just the sheer quantity of pedestrians. And so there are those big streets that succeed as pedestrian-only spaces. There are also a lot of small ones. For example, in Charleston, which has blocks not as large as the ones in Salt Lake, but big, square blocks that are subdivided by small and subordinate streets and rear lanes to make them more penetrable. And that permeability comes from streets like Longitude Lane. Or in places that are topographically challenged, like St. Thomas and the U.S. Virgin Islands, many of the streets end because the Danish plan was a pretty regular grid laid on the topography. They end when they get too steep, and they turn into steps. And the step streets, in fact, they have a big concentration of them in Charlotte Amalia and the Virgin Islands, are legit addresses. In fact, they're great addresses because the way those terrace houses step up the landscape produces phenomenal views across the harbor from those step streets, and they're just another part of a rich menu. Why not? It's okay to have a pedestrian-only street. In fact, the idea of that is really taken to a high point in a place that Chip Kaufman wrote about in the book. He wrote an essay for us about some of the grand and big streets in Melbourne, in Australia. And as we read through that and we were looking at the maps and going back and forth with Chip via email about that, what became apparent was that he was writing about the big streets, but it was really a story about network, because Melbourne's beauty is revealed in the smallest streets. The laneways, is that the right vernacular, Chip? The laneway, like Center Place and Melbourne here. Look at for those of you who are in the back, you may have to look over someone's head, but look at the bottom of the frame. There's a 2-year-old in the middle of the street, several inches away from the nearest parent. Okay? And it's working out just fine. The world didn't come to an end. Johnny Longo wrote about a street in Tokyo for the book, which is the Ginza, which for most of the time, for most of its length, is a pedestrian-only street. And we're seeing situations where people are getting more creative about when to pedestrianize for part of the day or part of the week and not other times, using examples like this. And one last point, just in talking about discoveries about the book. The new urbanists walk around North America, I do it too, doing this. You know, we think we're filmmakers framing the next shot, right? And it's because we're talking about the proportion of height to width, the height of the buildings that frame the public room of the street relative to its width. And we explained to everybody that when it gets too wide, the sense of space dissipates and so on. It's all documented in even the foundational literature of the new urbanism. We think about streets that way. And so we're always drawing the height to width diagrams. That concept has been with us since the very first Congress and long before. It's enshrined in Lead ND, the proportion of height to width. Now, one thing about that, the innovation, of course, is drawing the buildings in the same drawing where you draw the cross-section of the curbs and gutters and lampposts and tree placement and parking and so on. So just getting the transpocracy to think about that part of it was a big breakthrough. And so for 21 years, we've been riding on that. What that still does is gets us to think about the street like it's a tube of space, which it sometimes is, but not always. It gets us to think about the street design as a thing that can be extruded, like a channel is extruded in a steel mill, like rolling out an I-beam, with the tolerances of a very similar width all the way down, similar gap between similar height of the pieces on each side being run down like flanges. And some streets are like that. The regularity of that is what gives order to a lot of cities. And so we study the ones big and small that have various proportions, and we learn from them. Here, talk about bringing nature in. Here's a pretty good example. The Bois Boulogne is in the back, and the Avenue Foch brings it into the very center of the Paris pictures taken from the Arc de Triomphe. So we think about it like that. Or we think about main streets like that. And we explain to people this relationship that the Bob Gibbs perfect 85-foot wide street, right, has this public room aspect. And so we draw it in section, but now we're drawing the buildings. Well, we continue that in the book, and we explain it, but then we go back and we question some things about it. And first of all, instead of saying that's the only thing to measure about the street, why don't you check all the other stuff, like the way the street ends. You know, where's the vista go? What are we framing or deflecting or terminating? And then also trying to take streets that people know and reveal something about them they probably hadn't noticed. The Avenue d'Iéna, for example, is featured in the book in an essay that's entitled "The Most Beautiful Parking Lot in the World." In one block, there are over 300 on-street parking spaces in the multi-lane, multi-way boulevard. Between the ones that are on the side access lanes and the ones that are on the center medians, it adds up to a whole heck of a lot of parking, and yet doesn't look like a parking lot, right? So actually, it's a tremendous success for the people who are always looking for how to solve that. And so someone did ask me, are there going to be dimensions? Yes, Anthea, there are going to be dimensions. And there are a lot of sections with the details of those things in there. We went back to those things and we said, wait, if it's a public room, it doesn't have just 2 walls and a floor. If it's a room, it's a space that has definition in the other direction as well. Not all the streets can be Parisian radials or boring Manhattan avenues that go on forever. Something has to happen to conclude that space. And in fact, in the main street, that often happens. Now, Gibbs looks at this picture and he says, look, the signs and the merchandise and storefronts are tipped into view. And that is true. That's one of the reasons why I perform really well. But also, the spatial quality of the place is concluded. And so, you can see how that happens in plan. A little figure ground of Galena shows it doesn't take much, just the slightest little curve adapting to the topography in that case produces that effect, so that the street doesn't go on forever. It actually concludes in a special way. And it isn't one tube, it's a whole series of spatial experiences that are linked, one after the other. And you walk through it, less like a map, more like a movie. You can see that. And so once we started trying to draw that and write it and measure it, we started seeing it in place after place. Here's a famous UK example. Douglas Duane wrote an essay for us about his experience reenacted in real time with a camera with John walking through the street space sequence in Orvieto. And the thing about that was they found a regular rhythm to the events, like the ones you see in the upper right-hand corner here, where something spatially happens to end one segment and start another. In fact, there is a grammar to that, a rhythm to it, that's detectable in the plan, but experienced in 3 dimensions. And so even the places where repetition is used to signal high order or to send some sort of signal about the dominance of the state or the rational workings of the nation, like in Regent Street, have this kind of thing happening. They have a series of experiences laid end to end. What's valuable for you as new urbanists is this. When you're sitting down with a traffic engineer and you're trying to fight out what to do about that highway that goes through Main Street, remind them that this 300 feet or this 1,000 feet are more important than the other ones upstream and downstream. That this segment doesn't have to be treated with exactly the same cross-section, the same speed, the same trees, the same details. We went back to Raymond Unwin and went back and looked again at the idea of the lean-in tree, which is a very powerful spatial definer, which once you learn to notice it, you begin seeing all over the place, concludes the space. Sometimes as powerfully with just landscape as we do with buildings. The book has chapters on historic streets, retrofitted streets, and new streets, with an extra chapter on this network stuff in there among them. And so we document attempts in more recently built streets to get this spatial variety to happen, to show streets that change along their length, like the important Main Street at Rosemary. And some of the conditions under which those are illustrated are retrofits, and some are greenfields, and some are historic restorations. So I hope you'll be able to get the feeling that these principles transcend those categories and actually can be applied in all three situations. This is the list John was talking about, which I was trying to frantically complete, and we may have missed someone's name, but of people who contributed an essay in the book, or allowed us to adapt something that we had heard them say into a passage in the book and illustrate it. And so thank all the many new urbanists, kind of a high-octane group, who agreed to do that. And then a lot of people also contributed case studies or imagery, photographs or drawings from their projects or from places that they knew that helped us illustrate the principles. And here are some of them. So with that, I think we should stop talking about the art of street design and start hearing what the questions are about it. Thank you very much. You know how to bring the lights up? Do you know how to bring the lights up? Does someone know how to bring the lights up? Marcy, are you moderating this?
I can moderate, yeah. Can everybody hear? Is anybody able to turn the lights up for us? I see somebody raising their hand. Okay. So this question and answer period could be really easy because someone might ask a question and you can just say, buy the book. Yes, we have a question.
Yes, my name is John. Who is your target audience? Is this to give to my favorite traffic engineer or my local NPO?
You explain why it took 2 years of discussion to come up with a subtitle, which we don't know whether the publisher is going to accept yet or not. So we're still, on October 21st, when we have the book out, I hope this is what you find out. I hope you find out that for the people who already know a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, they can just flip like a reference book down to the case study that interests them. If they want to know about Kensington High Street, they just turn to that page. We will forgive them for not reading the introductory essay and all that stuff. And they're going to find dimensions and the story of how it happened and who did what and that kind of thing in there. On the other hand, so for technicians, that's going to be really useful. On the other hand, there are a lot of big pictures in the book, including about 50 big color pages, 50 big photographs in color. So you can hand that to an elected official. And basically in those 50 color pictures is a 50-slideshow on what makes us a competitive city versus a not competitive city. You can just see it right there in those pictures. So I hope that you'll be able to span the boundaries. In the end, what we really want is a book we can take with us to charrettes that we don't have right now. We have a lot of good books. Alan Jacobs' book, Great Streets, is so useful. We take it with us everywhere we go, and we use it all the time. And it's a tremendous catalog. But it leaves some things to be filled in by other books, and hopefully we've added some details and some kinds of streets and things that aren't covered in that one. So now sorry for the people whose charrette luggage is already really heavy, but you're going to have to take both.
We actually hired an editor from the New Yorker who has no design background, and she made us rewrite the book quite a bit. And
at least 3 times.
And my brother, who's a homeopath who may be biased, has read most of it since Alice worked on it, and he's been telling everyone that it's for everyone. You know, that it explains things in a way that everyone can understand. And last thing I'll add is I'm quite impressed by Jeff's book.
Yeah.
And how successful Jeff has been in getting the word out, and how successful Ellen and June were in getting the word out. And we're hoping that, like those books, we will appeal to more people than the ones in this room.
We should probably just advertise it as a pictorial companion to Jeff Speck's great book.
Other questions?
You got to buy at least 10 copies for that endorsement.
So, do you have a question, Jeff?
Okay, find somebody else.
Should we talk about US DOT?
Well, definitely. Okay, so rural, which means rural, and urbanized, which means suburban, isn't a good enough toolkit. And so the functional classifications that originate with the federal government and are enshrined and promulgated by AASHTO result in some of this blunt instrument kind of surgery. So Rick Hall suggested that the way to solve this would be to say there is an area, there is a place, the new traditional neighborhood you're trying to build, or the old traditional neighborhood that you're trying to revive or save or restore, or the dead shopping center that you're trying to retrofit as new urbanism. The transit corridor, there are places, pretty important places, where the rules that assume wider is better and faster is better are the wrong rules. And so, I'm paraphrasing. Rick, how am I doing? All right, so Rick suggested that we should have a category that's really for us to do our thing. And in that place, you wouldn't do the dumb level of service calculation as the technique for deciding whether or not your design was successful or the right thing to do. You wouldn't use the wrong design speeds in working out the design. You would use the right design speeds. And so that concept is really the basis for what we have been pitching. And I'm sure this idea is going to get better as we get 1,200 people to help refine it. So the essence of it is we have a petition circulating. We have a couple hundred signatures already. It has been said that new urbanists like to get in on the ground floor, so you can sign it first, and then we'll go online and see how many more signatures we can find. But we'd like to send back a message to the DOT that says, give this research, this idea research. It could be a simple turning on of a light bulb that we've needed for a really long time. When we go deal with a state DOT over an issue that's impacting one of our local government clients or communities or developers, they like to say things like, well, the feds would never let us do that. Or FHWA doesn't recommend that. So, and we often have to call them on it and say, well, wait, here's the book FHWA endorsed, and here's page 26 of the ITE recommended practice, and so on. And the approach we've been using for 20 years is to try and understand their literature a little bit so we can open to the right page and say, no, it does say you have flexibility here. In the end, what they don't like to do is the 20 or 30 pages of paperwork asking for design exceptions, right? That's essentially it. And so why should it have to be an exception to do the right thing? Okay, you want to turn that into something more?
Well, adding a little bit to that, to begin with, you can identify these places because they're the ones that get a level of service F. So they failed the system, and so they get bumped up into the urban system. And we're starting to come up with things that I'm sure will get much better, like instead of a loss, we're going to have a win, the walkability index number from an index that Hall Engineering has worked out. And, I actually, I like cars. I've had a lot of good cars in my life. I actually don't own a car anymore. And my office is down at Broadway and Bleecker in Manhattan. A lot of you have walked around there with me. And a lot of the streets around there are like pedestrian free zones now. And instead of like out in the suburbs where it's, an auto free zone and pedestrian has to get out of the way. And we just, we need a few places that, where the car is not the king. It's as simple as that.
So is that circulating? You have, okay, Rick Hall has that petition.